When you think of game changers in war, you probably picture big things like advanced weaponry, new technology, superior army size, or the element of surprise. But oftentimes it's the little things, very little things, that make a big difference. It can't be a surprise that disease often accompanies war. Illness spreads quickly in the unsanitary conditions of the battlefield, where men live in crowded conditions and adequate nutrition can be difficult to come by. And so it can devastate armies without warning. During the American Revolution, for example, an estimated 6,800 Americans died as a result of combat wounds, while somewhere around 17,000 died of disease. That makes disease responsible for just over 70% of American deaths during the Revolution. But more than that, disease may have played a role in bringing about the American victory. Consider, for example, the role of smallpox between 1775 and 1778. Historically speaking, smallpox has been an absolute scourge on human populations. Caused by the variola virus, a highly contagious microbe, the effects of smallpox on the human body are quite gruesome. Flu-like symptoms are quickly followed by a rash that spreads across the body and the emergence of pustules filled with a thick, dark liquid. As the disease progresses, these pustules form a crust and scab over, typically leaving scars as these scabs fall off. Smallpox incapacitates its victims for nearly a month and causes death in about 30% of cases. This, then, was the disease that struck George Washington's army in Boston during the fall and winter of 1775. As we have already noted, smallpox is quite deadly, killing 1 out of every 3 infected people. But like many infectious diseases, it also generally granted immunity to those who survived. Outside of coastal cities like Boston and New York, smallpox was relatively rare among colonial populations. It was much more common in England, and so many British soldiers fighting in the Revolutionary War had immunity as a result of childhood exposure. Their American counterparts did not. At nearly the same time as the Boston outbreak, the Northern Army in Quebec also found itself fighting off a smallpox epidemic that left approximately 1/3 of American soldiers unfit for war. Disease was threatening to destroy the whole Continental Army, practically ensuring a revolutionary defeat. And all of this was happening about 20 years before Edward Jenner developed the smallpox vaccine, when the only approved treatment for smallpox epidemic was isolation, hardly ideal for an army at war. But there was another, somewhat radical, at least by colonial American standards, option: inoculation. Now, the idea of inoculation, which is the process of deliberately infecting a healthy person with a milder form of a live virus, had been introduced to the colonies, and to Massachusetts in particular, by a man named Cotton Mather in 1721. Mather is believed to have learned about inoculation from one of his West African slaves who told Mather that he had undergone the operation, which had given him something of the smallpox and forever preserved him from it, adding that it was often used in West Africa. Working with a local Boston doctor named Boylston, Mather would push local authorities to use inoculation as a way of avoiding epidemics. Their pleas were largely met with resistance, though Boylston would use inoculation on his patients during an outbreak of smallpox in 1721. The experiment proved to many that this radical treatment could work, and one important believer was George Washington, who had himself survived a bout with smallpox when he was 19 and was left with immunity. He encouraged his wife Martha to undergo the inoculation treatment, which she did in 1776, joining other well-known figures like John Adams, his wife Abigail, and their 4 children. But inoculation was by no means universally accepted. And so Washington was faced with a choice: inoculate and take the risks that came with that, including the possibility of death for some soldiers and the certainty that a sizable portion of his army would be out of commission during recovery, or continue the standard practice of isolating infected soldiers and hoping for the best. There was no consensus on the right course of action. Finally, in February of 1777, Washington issued an order that required all recruits arriving in Philadelphia to be inoculated, and then held in strict quarantine until they recovered. Quarantine hospitals were built to segregate recovering soldiers from the general population, and he recommended that states immunize their recruits before sending them to join the fight in order to protect the larger army from unintentional infection. The program was so successful that Washington repeated it at Valley Forge in the winter of 1778. As the program and its success spread, recruitment and reenlistment increased, and the Continental Army was reshaped into a healthy and effective fighting force that would eventually win the Revolutionary War. Thus, Washington had won perhaps the most important battle of the early Revolution, the battle against smallpox. The story of disease was a little different in the Southern campaign of the late Revolution, where tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever wreaked havoc on soldiers, though in this case they disproportionately affected the British Army to the benefit of the Americans. Both yellow fever and malaria are spread by the lowly mosquito. Each begins with a milder phase that includes flu-like symptoms, but can move into a second phase that includes kidney failure and acute respiratory distress in the case of malaria, and liver failure and bleeding in the gastrointestinal tract in the case of yellow fever. With both diseases, the second, more toxic phase often results in death. These tropical fevers were unknown in the Americas until the 16th century because the species of mosquito that caused the virus weren't indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. But these mosquitoes came to the Americas on the merchant and slaving vessels at the heart of the Columbian Exchange. And with mosquitoes came disease. The early sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil made particularly ideal habitats for these mosquitoes, as plantation-style farming led to denser populations that could serve as hosts, while simultaneously destroying the habitats of natural insect predators like birds and bats. Malaria and yellow fever were particularly deadly to newcomers who had no natural or acquired immunities and fell prey to the disease in devastating numbers. From there, these diseases spread northward into subtropical and coastal areas of the British southern colonies, with epidemics throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. But as with many infectious diseases, those fortunate enough to survive malaria and yellow fever were generally granted lifetime immunity, in the case of yellow fever, or at least increased resistance in the case of malaria. This bestowed a sort of immunological advantage on the long-term residents of areas prone to tropical diseases, including the inhabitants of coastal South Carolina and Georgia in 1780, when a summertime fever outbreak in the Low Country devastated British soldiers. Unlike American militiamen, many of whom had faced the threat of malaria and yellow fever every summer, the British soldiers had little exposure and virtually no immunity to these killers. And so in 1781, Lord Cornwallis, commander of the British Army in the South, was forced to move his army northward to Virginia to escape the mosquito-based menace that was decimating his army. His superiors, though, sent him to the Tidewater region, and by June of 1781, malaria had attacked his army once again, leaving half his soldiers unfit for service. He would surrender within 4 months, ending the American Revolution and establishing independence for the former colonies. History is funny. In general, people want to think that historical change is driven largely by human action. We talk about the American Revolution in terms of the founding fathers, military strategy, and the battles that each side won and lost. But equally important to American victory was disease and immunity, and occasionally sheer geographic luck. Thank you for your time.